Two 16-year-old girls did something at their father's award ceremony that I still can't believe they had the courage to do. They walked on stage, took the microphone, and announced to 1,000 people that their billionaire father, the man about to be honored as CEO of the Year, was having another baby. A baby he'd asked their mother to keep secret for 2 weeks, until after his big night, because heaven forbid his messy family life complicate his perfect image. His daughters knew something he'd forgotten. 16 years ago, they were the secret babies. The ones he sent checks to but never showed up for. The ones who waited at windows on birthdays he missed. And they refused, absolutely refused, to let their baby brother grow up feeling invisible the way they did. So they grabbed that microphone and forced their father to choose. Right there, in front of everyone. And if you've ever been the woman who carried the weight while a man carried his image, or if you've watched your children wonder why they weren't enough to make someone stay, you already know this isn't just a story. This is every promise that was almost kept. Every family dinner where someone was missing. Every time you swallowed the truth because speaking it would have been too inconvenient for someone else. The moment Brian Rowe's twin daughters took the microphone at his award ceremony, his entire empire held its breath. 1,000 people had been on their feet just seconds before. Investors in tailored suits, politicians with practiced smiles, tech founders who'd flown in from 3 continents, journalists with cameras already rolling. The Grand Meridian Ballroom glittered like a cathedral built for ambition. Crystal chandeliers caught the light. Champagne glasses clinked. Brian's face was projected 20 feet high on the screen behind the stage. Sharp jaw, graying temples, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself twice. Visionary, philanthropist, industry, icon. The words floated above his head like a benediction. Brian had given speeches in boardrooms in Tokyo, galas in Zurich, conferences in New York. He knew exactly when to pause for effect, when to let humility soften his voice, when to make a room full of strangers feel like they were witnessing something historic. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Another award, another standing ovation, another line on a resume already thick with accomplishments. But then a voice cut through the applause. Young, female, steady. "Before our father accepts this award," the voice said. Brian froze mid-step. His hand was still reaching for the crystal trophy. His smile was still in place. But his heart stopped cold. He turned toward the side of the stage, confusion flickering across his face, and that's when he saw them, Edith and Debbie, his twin daughters, 16 years old. Identical down to the curve of their cheekbones, but completely different in every way that mattered. Edith stood like she'd been carved from marble, straight-backed, shoulders squared, eyes sharp and unflinching. Debbie clutched the microphone with both hands, her fingers trembling just enough to catch the light. But her gaze didn't waver. They weren't supposed to be on that stage. They weren't even supposed to speak tonight. Brian's throat went dry. His pulse hammered in his ears. Panic hit first, pure, primal panic, the kind that makes your vision narrow and your lungs forget how to work. But the fear that followed was worse. Not fear of scandal, not fear of the cameras already swiveling toward his daughters. Fear of something far more dangerous. Truth. "Dad," Debbie said softly, and her voice echoed through the ballroom like a prayer no one was ready to hear. "We wanted to give you a real award tonight." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Nervous, uncertain. People glanced at each other, trying to figure out if this was planned, if this was part of the show. Brian tried to smile. His lips moved, but his throat felt like sandpaper. Edith stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd thought about every word for days. "You've always said leadership means responsibility," she said, her eyes locking onto her father's. "And legacy means telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." The laughter died. The ballroom went still in that specific, suffocating way that happens when a room full of people realizes they're about to witness something unscripted, something real, something that can't be taken back. Brian felt it, the shift, the instinctive hush. 1,000 people leaning forward without moving. "And the truth," Edith continued, each word deliberate, measured, "is that our family is about to grow." Brian's breath caught in his chest. Time slowed. The chandeliers above seemed too bright, the room too small. Debbie swallowed hard, then said it. "You're going to have another child." Silence. Not the polite kind, not the confused kind, the shocked kind, the kind that feels like the air has been sucked out of a room. Brian heard his own name whispered, once, twice, a dozen times, like a prayer and a curse tangled together. Someone near the front row gasped. Another person said, "What?" out loud, the word hanging in the air like an accusation. Cameras clicked, sharp, rapid, relentless. Brian's hands went numb. His pulse roared so loud he could barely hear his own thoughts. His eyes searched the crowd desperately, scanning faces, looking for the one person who could make sense of this. And then he found her, Vesta Kim. She stood near the back of the ballroom, half hidden by a marble column. One hand rested on her stomach, instinctive, protective, the gesture of a woman who'd been carrying a secret too heavy for one person. Her other hand was clenched at her side, knuckles white. Her face was pale, but her expression was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes from years of holding things together when everything around you is falling apart. She hadn't planned this. Brian knew it instantly. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't her punishing him in front of 1,000 witnesses. This was inevitability. This was the truth he'd been trying to manage, to schedule, to control, finally refusing to wait any longer. The room blurred. Faces became shapes. Voices became noise. But Brian's mind went somewhere else entirely. 16 years back, to a different version of himself. A younger man with hunger in his eyes, and a startup that was either going to make him rich or bankrupt him by 30. And Vesta. Vesta, who'd been his first real hire. Brilliant, strategic, unshakable. The woman who'd believed in his company before anyone else did. The woman who'd fixed his tie before investor meetings. Who'd brought him coffee at 2 a.m. when they were building something neither of them fully understood yet. He'd loved her. Quietly. Not loudly enough to choose her when it mattered. Not bravely enough to stay when fear told him to run. When she'd told him she was pregnant, not just pregnant, but twins, Brian had been standing on the edge of everything he'd ever wanted. CEO, empire, legacy. And fear had whispered in his ear, the way it always does when you're about to lose something you haven't earned yet. So he didn't disappear. He didn't deny paternity. He did something worse. He delegated fatherhood, checks every month, legal agreements, distance wrapped up in responsibility. He told himself it was enough. That providing was the same as presence. That money could replace the sound of his voice, reading bedtime stories, or the weight of his hand on their small shoulders when they were scared. Vesta had raised Edith and Debbie alone, with grace, with dignity, with a kind of strength Brian had never possessed. She'd never poisoned them against him, never told them he was a coward, never said the words that would have been justified. Instead, she'd said, "He loves you. He just doesn't know how to show it yet." And Brian had let her carry that lie for 10 years. Now, standing under lights bright enough to expose everything, Brian realized what his daughters were doing. They weren't exposing him. They were challenging him. Edith turned back to the audience, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Our mom didn't ask us to say this," she said clearly, calmly. "She didn't even want us to." Brian saw Vesta's eyes widen, saw her shake her head slightly, a silent plea for her daughters to stop. But Debbie pressed on. "We're not children anymore," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "And we don't want our little sibling growing up as a secret." Brian's chest tightened so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The host, a man in his 50s with a microphone and a script he'd memorized, rushed forward, whispering urgently into Brian's ear. "Sir, we need to move on. Let's get you to your speech." But Brian lifted one hand. The gesture was small, quiet, but it silenced the host immediately. "No," Brian said hoarsely, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't since he was 16 himself. "Let them speak." The crowd leaned in, 1,000 people holding their breath. Brian looked at his daughters, really looked at them, and saw 16 years of absence reflected back at him. 16 years of missed recitals and forgotten birthdays and phone calls that went to voicemail. 16 years of telling himself he was doing enough when he was doing the bare minimum. "This award," Brian said, his voice no longer polished, no longer practiced, "was supposed to honor my leadership." He looked at Edith, at Debbie, at the two young women who shared his DNA and none of his cowardice. "But tonight, they reminded me that leadership starts at home." He turned toward Vesta, standing at the back of the room with one hand still resting on the child she was carrying, the child he'd asked her to keep secret for 2 more weeks. 2 weeks, as if love could be scheduled. "And I failed you once," Brian said. The words tasted like confession, like something he should have said 16 years ago. "I won't do that again." Vesta didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. The ballroom erupted, not in applause, not yet, in chaos. Phones came out, reporters scrambled. Brian's PR team stood frozen near the exit, faces pale, trying to calculate damage they couldn't control. Clayton, Brian's COO, was texting furiously. Once, twice, 5 times. But for the first time in his life, Brian Rowe ignored all of it. The market didn't matter. The headlines didn't matter. The stock price, the board, the investors waiting for his next move. None of it mattered. You know that feeling when someone's life splits into before and after in a single moment? That's what just happened to Brian. And if you've ever watched someone you love make the same mistake twice, or caught yourself repeating patterns you swore you'd break, you understand why this story matters. Stay with me. This gets deeper than scandal, because what happened on that stage? That wasn't just a daughter's rebellion. That was a daughter's love. But to understand why Edith and Debbie chose public humiliation over private conversation, we need to go back. Back to when Brian Rowe was just a man with a startup dream, and Vesta Kim was the woman who believed in him first. Pay close attention to what Brian does next, because this is where the pattern starts. 16 years earlier, Vesta Kim walked into Brian Rowe's life, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing confidence like armor. She was his first real hire, not an intern, not a favor to a friend's cousin. A strategic hire, someone who could look at his chaotic startup and see the architecture underneath the mess. She had a degree in operations management and eyes that could dissect a business plan in under 3 minutes. When she sat across from him in that cramped office above a Thai restaurant in downtown Seattle, Brian knew 2 things instantly. 1, she was smarter than him. 2, he needed her more than she needed him. "Your projections are optimistic," she'd said, tapping her pen against his pitch deck. "But your infrastructure can't support this kind of scale. You'll collapse by year 2 unless you build systems now." Brian had hired her on the spot. That was the beginning. Late nights followed. The kind where the city goes quiet, and you're the only 2 people left in the building, surrounded by empty coffee cups and whiteboards covered in diagrams that look like prayers written in dry erase marker. She'd fix his tie before investor meetings, her fingers quick and efficient, not lingering but careful. He'd bring her coffee at 2 in the morning, black, no sugar, the way she liked it, and she'd look up from her laptop with gratitude in her eyes that made his chest feel too tight. The connection between them wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just was. Inevitable. Like gravity. They didn't talk about it for months. Didn't name it. Just let it exist in the space between professional and personal. Until one night, exhausted, euphoric from landing their first major contract, Brian kissed her in the parking garage, and Vesta kissed him back. For 6 months, they built 2 things, a company and something that felt dangerously close to a future. They were careful, discreet. Brian told himself it was about professionalism, but the truth was simpler and more selfish. He didn't want investors questioning his judgment. Didn't want the board thinking he was distracted. Didn't want anyone to see Vesta as anything other than the brilliant strategist she was. He loved her quietly. Not loudly enough to claim her in public, not bravely enough to let the world see what she meant to him. And then, one Tuesday morning, Vesta walked into his office, closed the door, and said 5 words that changed everything. "Brian, I'm pregnant. It's twins." For 3 seconds, exactly 3, Brian's face did what it was supposed to do. His eyes widened. His mouth curved into something close to joy. He stood up from his desk, reached for her hand, and then fear hit. Not the kind that makes you brave, the kind that makes you a coward. Because Brian Rowe was on the brink. The company had just secured Series A funding. The board was talking about expansion into 3 new markets. Forbes was writing a profile. His face was about to be on magazine covers with words like visionary and disruptor underneath it. He was 28 years old and 6 months away from becoming the kind of man people wrote case studies about. And Vesta was pregnant. With twins. The stakes were impossible. Choose love or choose empire. Choose the woman who believed in him first, or choose the legacy he'd been building since he was 19 and hungry. Brian chose wrong. He didn't disappear. That would have been cleaner, in a way. Easier to hate. He didn't deny paternity. Didn't demand a DNA test or accuse her of trapping him. He did something worse. He delegated fatherhood. "I'll support you," he said, his voice steady, controlled, the same voice he used in board meetings. "Financially, legally, whatever you need." Vesta stared at him. "I don't need a benefactor, Brian. I need a partner." "I can't," he stopped, started again. "The company is at a critical stage. The board," Vesta repeated, and something in her voice went cold. "Right. I'm not abandoning you," Brian said, and he believed it. That's the terrible part. He actually believed it. "I'll set up an account. Monthly deposits, health insurance, everything. Everything except you." Brian looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exact moment she stopped expecting him to be brave. "I love you," he said. "Just not loudly enough to choose me," Vesta finished. She walked out of his office that day, and Brian told himself he'd done the responsible thing, the mature thing. He'd provided. He'd committed financially. He'd done what most men in his position wouldn't. But Vesta Kim, didn't need his money. She needed his presence, and he gave her everything but that. Vesta raised Edith and Debbie alone, not bitterly, not with the kind of rage that would have been justified. She did it with a dignity that made Brian's absence look even more pathetic by comparison. When the girls asked about their father, and they did constantly, the way children do when there's a hole in their lives shaped like a person, Vesta never lied. "He loves you," she'd say, brushing Edith's hair or helping Debbie with homework. "He just doesn't know how to show it yet." Yet. As if love was a skill you learned. As if showing up was something you got better at with practice instead of a choice you made every single day. She was exhausted in ways Brian would never understand. 3 a.m. feedings alone, both babies crying in stereo. First steps he missed because he was in London closing a deal. First words he didn't hear because he was giving a TED talk about innovation. Birthday parties where the twins blew out candles and looked toward the door, hoping. Vesta saw it. Every time. The hope, the disappointment, the slow, painful adjustment to a father who existed in theory but not in practice. She just wanted partnership. That's all she ever wanted. Meanwhile, Brian's empire grew. Offices in 12 cities. Revenue in 9 figures. His name in headlines. His company went public when the twins were 4. Brian rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange and smiled for cameras. And that same day, Debbie took her first solo bike ride and fell and scraped her knee so badly it bled through her jeans. Vesta was the one who held her, who cleaned the wound, who whispered, "You're so brave, baby, so brave." Brian was in Manhattan celebrating. He kept their lives in separate boxes. Empire in one, family in another. The checks cleared automatically on the first of every month. Generous, punctual, impersonal. He had photos of the twins in his desk drawer. Professional portraits Vesta sent him once a year. He'd look at them sometimes, late at night when the office was empty, and feel something close to grief. But he never showed those photos to anyone. Never mentioned he had daughters in interviews. Never let his 2 worlds touch. He told himself this was enough. That distance was protection. That providing was the same as loving. He was wrong. That desk drawer with the photos, remember it. It becomes evidence later. Brian stayed away for 10 years. 10 years of birthdays acknowledged by check. 10 years of bedtime stories told by one voice instead of 2. 10 years of Edith and Debbie learning that their father was a concept, not a person. 10 years of Vesta carrying the weight of 2 parents because one of them chose not to show up. 10 years of believing distance was protection. And then Edith got sick. What happened next forced Brian to finally show up. But by then, the damage had shape. 10-year-old Edith collapsed during recess on a Tuesday in March. One moment she was standing near the swing set, watching Debbie race another girl to the monkey bars. The next, her vision went white at the edges. Her knees buckled, and she hit the ground hard enough that the playground monitor heard the sound from 20 feet away. Debbie saw it happen. Saw her sister, her twin, her other half, the person who shared not just her DNA, but her entire existence, crumple like something inside her had simply switched off. She screamed, not a yell, a scream, the kind that comes from a place deeper than your lungs, from the animal part of your brain that knows when something is terribly, catastrophically wrong. By the time the nurse arrived, Debbie was on the ground next to Edith, holding her hand, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Wake up, please wake up." Edith's eyes fluttered. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The call reached Vesta at 2:47 p.m. She was in a meeting, client presentation, the kind she'd spent weeks preparing for, When her phone buzzed against the conference table, she ignored it the first time, the second time. By the third, something in her chest went cold. She stepped out of the room, answered, "Ms. Kim, this is Roosevelt Elementary. Your daughter fainted. We've called an ambulance." Vesta was in her car in under 90 seconds. She didn't remember saying goodbye, didn't remember grabbing her keys. Just the highway blurring past and her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and a prayer she didn't believe in repeating in her head like a mantra. Please, please, please. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and fear. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too sterile, making everything feel unreal. Debbie sat in a plastic chair, still in her school uniform, tear tracks dried on her cheeks, staring at nothing. Vesta held her, rocked her, whispered things that didn't mean anything but sounded like comfort. 3 hours later, a doctor came out, young, tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from delivering bad news too many times in one shift. "Your daughter has severe anemia," he said. "Her iron levels are critically low. We need to run more tests, but she's going to need specialist care, ongoing treatment." Vesta nodded. "Whatever she needs." "The treatment plan we're recommending, it's comprehensive. Insurance will cover some of it, but I'll handle it," Vesta said. But when she saw the preliminary estimate, her stomach dropped. She could handle it, barely. If she stopped saving, if she pushed back every financial goal she'd been working toward for a decade, if she carried this alone the way she'd carried everything else. But she was tired, so tired. And for the first time in 10 years, Vesta did something she swore she'd never do. She called Brian. Her hands shook as she dialed. Her pride, the pride that had kept her upright, through 10 years of single parenting, 10 years of answering questions about why Daddy wasn't at the school play, 10 years of being enough for two people, that pride shattered with every ring. An assistant answered, professional, polite, a human barrier between Brian Rowe and the rest of the world. "I need to speak to Brian," Vesta said, her voice cracking. "Mr. Rowe is in a meeting. May I take a message?" "Tell him it's Vesta. Tell him it's about his daughter. Tell him—" She stopped, breathed. "Tell him I need him." 2 minutes later, Brian's voice came through the phone. "Vesta, I need you," she said. And then, because she needed him to understand, "Not your money. You." The line went quiet for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. "I'll be there in an hour," Brian said. For once, he meant it. Brian walked into Seattle Children's Hospital 53 minutes later, still wearing his suit from the board meeting he'd walked out of mid-sentence. His tie was loosened. His hair was disheveled in a way it never was. He looked like a man who'd driven 90 miles an hour and barely remembered the trip. Vesta met him in the hallway outside Edith's room. She looked exhausted, beautiful and exhausted, and holding herself together with nothing but willpower. "Room 412, she said. "Debbie's with her." Brian nodded, hesitated. "Thank you for calling me." "I didn't do it for you," Vesta said quietly. "I did it for them." When Brian pushed open the door to room 412, 2 pairs of identical eyes turned toward him. Edith was pale against the hospital sheets, an IV line running into her small arm. Debbie sat on the edge of the bed, holding her sister's hand like she'd been doing it for hours. They looked at him like a stranger who happened to share their DNA. "Hi," Brian said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Debbie spoke first. "Are you the money man?" The question hit Brian like a fist to the sternum. I'm your father," he managed. "Mom talks about—" "You like you're a ghost," Edith said, her voice weak but sharp, analytical. The kind of intelligence that made Brian's chest tighten because he recognized it. It was his. She'd inherited his mind, and he'd never been there to see it develop. Brian didn't know what to say. Every word he'd practiced in the car evaporated. So he pulled up a chair, sat down, and stayed. The vigil that followed cracked something inside Brian that had been calcified for a decade. He stayed overnight, first time ever. Dozed in a chair that made his back ache. Woke up every time a nurse came in. Watched Vesta wipe Edith's forehead with a damp cloth when her fever spiked at midnight. Somewhere around 2 a.m., Debbie climbed into his lap. She didn't mean to. She was half asleep, disoriented, reaching for comfort without thinking. And when she realized it was him, this stranger who was supposed to be her father, she froze. But she didn't move away. Brian held her, carefully, like she might break, like he might break. She fell asleep on his shoulder. At 3 a.m., Vesta found him in the hallway, staring at his hands. "You can't just show up for emergencies and disappear when it's convenient," she said. "Not cruel, just tired, honest." "I know." "Do you?" Brian looked at her. "Teach me how to stay." And Vesta, who had every right to tell him it was too late, that he'd made his choice a decade ago, that you don't get to opt in after opting out for 10 years. Vesta nodded. "Okay, but if you start, you finish. No halfway? No, let me check my calendar. You're in or you're out." "I'm in." The integration wasn't smooth. Nothing about it was smooth. Brian showed up to follow-up appointments, awkward and out of place, in waiting rooms full of parents who'd been doing this from day one. He sat through family dinners, where the girls were polite but distant, answering his questions like he was conducting an interview. He learned their favorite foods through trial and error. Edith liked spicy ramen, the kind that made her eyes water. Debbie liked anything with cinnamon, toast, oatmeal, hot chocolate. He bought parenting books, read them late at night in hotel rooms between business trips. Discovered that business books don't prepare you for 10-year-olds who ask questions like, "Why weren't you there?" and "Do you even like us?" Debbie warmed to him faster. She was softer, more forgiving. She wanted to believe. Edith kept score. Every promise he made, she filed away. Every time he showed up, she noted it. Every time he almost didn't, she saw it. And here's what Brian didn't realize. You can't show up at year 10 and expect year 1 forgiveness. Edith was keeping score, and the debt was deep. But Brian kept showing up anyway. Over the next 6 years, Brian became something he never thought he'd be. Present. Sunday dinners became routine. He made it to school plays, sat in auditoriums, and clapped too loud when his daughters took the stage. He helped with college prep, spent hours reviewing essays, drove them to campus visits, and slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice, he fell back in love with Vesta, quietly, carefully, without labels or grand declarations. They loved each other like people who'd survived something together. Stay with me here. Because what Brian does next will show you whether people can really change, or if they just get better at hiding who they've always been. And then, she got pregnant again. 6 years later, the Roe Kim family had found something that almost looked like normal. Sunday dinners became sacred. Not the formal, catered kind Brian used to attend at investor homes, but real dinners, Vesta cooking, Brian setting the table, the twins arguing over who got to control the playlist. They had inside jokes now, traditions, like how Brian always burned the garlic bread but refused to stop trying, or how Debbie rated every movie they watched on a scale of worth it to those are 2 hours I'll never get back. Edith at 16 still watched her father with analytical distance. She loved him, that much was clear, but she loved him carefully, with conditions, with scorecards. She noticed when he checked his phone during dinner, noticed when his attention drifted toward work, even when his body was present. Debbie, softer and more forgiving, had let him in completely. She texted him memes, asked for college advice, called him dad without the pause that used to follow. And Vesta and Brian, they'd found their way back to each other, carefully, without labels or public acknowledgement. They loved each other like people who'd survived something together, which is exactly what they were. No grand declarations, no ring, just presence, just showing up. Just the quiet commitment of two people who'd learned that love isn't about the beginning. It's about the choosing to stay. But fragile things break easily. And what they'd built was more fragile than any of them wanted to admit. Vesta discovered she was pregnant on a Thursday morning in late September. She sat on her bathroom floor, back against the tub, pregnancy test in her trembling hand, 2 pink lines, clear, undeniable. 40 years old and staring at the same plastic stick that had changed her life 16 years ago. Last time she'd held one of these, Brian had left. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. This time she was 40, not 24. This time the twins were 16, not a secret growing in her belly, while she tried to figure out how to raise them alone. This time, Brian had been present for 6 years, showed up, kept his promises, built something with her that felt real. But memory is a cruel companion. And sitting on that bathroom floor, Vesta felt the ghost of her younger self whispering, "He left before. What makes you think he'll stay now?" She told Brian 3 days later, in his car, after dinner. Not romantic, not planned, just practical. They were parked in her driveway. The twins were inside, probably doing homework or pretending to do homework. The engine was off, but neither of them had moved to leave. "I need to tell you something," Vesta said. Brian looked at her, really looked. "Okay, I'm pregnant." The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds. It felt like 5 hours. Brian's face did something complicated. Surprise. Fear. Then, and this was the part that mattered, something that looked like joy. "Vesta, I'm keeping this baby," she said, her voice steady, certain. "With or without you." "There's no without this time," Brian said immediately. Vesta wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. "Then we tell the twins," she said. "Together. Tomorrow." Brian nodded, then hesitated. "Can we wait until after the award ceremony?" 2 weeks. And there it was. The old Brian. The one who prioritized optics. The one who managed timelines and controlled narratives and made decisions based on how things would look instead of how they felt. Vesta's jaw tightened. "Why?" "It's a big night. Industry award. Press. I want to tell them the right way, not rushed, not distracted by what? Your image? That's not fair. Isn't it?" Brian ran a hand through his hair. 2 weeks, Vesta. That's all I'm asking." She wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at her to say no. To tell him that if he couldn't claim this child immediately, publicly, without hesitation, then he hadn't learned a damn thing. But she was tired, and he'd been good for 6 years. 6 years of showing up. That had to count for something. "Fine," she said. 2 weeks. She told herself it was reasonable. 2 weeks wasn't abandonment. 2 weeks was just timing. Just logistics. But something shifted in her eyes as she said it. Something Brian didn't see because he was already thinking about the ceremony, the speech, the optics. She'd seen this before, and it terrified her. Edith found the pregnancy test box 4 days later. She wasn't snooping, just taking out the bathroom trash, a chore on her list that she'd been avoiding. The box was right there, buried under tissues and cotton swabs, pale blue, unmistakable. Her heart stopped. She pulled it out, stared at it, read the label 3 times, like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Then she texted Debbie, "Come to Mom's bathroom. Now." Debbie arrived 60 seconds later, breathless. "What's wrong?" Edith held up the box. Debbie's eyes went wide. "Is that... yeah. Does that mean... yeah." They found Vesta in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up when they walked in, saw their faces, saw what Edith was holding. "Girls!" "Are you pregnant?" Edith asked. Vesta set down the knife, exhaled slowly. "Yes." Debbie's face split into a grin. "That's amazing. Does Dad know? When were you going to tell us?" "He knows," Vesta said carefully. "And we were going to tell you. Soon." "When?" Edith asked. Her voice was flat, analytical. The voice she used when she was building a case. Vesta hesitated. Fatal mistake. "Why are you waiting?" Edith pressed. "Your father asked me to wait to tell people until after the award ceremony." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "He's ashamed," Edith said. "No," Vesta said quickly. "He just wants to control the narrative." "That's the same thing," Debbie said quietly. And in that moment, standing in her mother's kitchen with a pregnancy test box in her hand, Edith saw the pattern with perfect clarity. 6 years of Sunday dinners hadn't erased 16 years of absence. 6 years of showing up didn't erase a decade of choosing empire over family. Her father had learned to be present when it was convenient, when it fit his schedule, when it didn't interfere with his image. But the moment that image was threatened, the moment transparency required courage instead of just logistics, he chose the same thing he always chose: control. Here's the thing about patterns. We don't break them by pretending they don't exist. We break them by refusing to repeat them. And these girls? They'd watched their father choose image over intimacy their entire lives. But if you've ever been the child who learned not to expect too much, who learned to be grateful for crumbs of attention, you know how this moment feels. It feels like standing at a crossroads. Accept the pattern or shatter it. The twins chose shatter. Edith didn't tell her mother what she was planning, didn't want to burden her with the weight of what was about to happen. Didn't tell Debbie until 3 days before the ceremony. They were in Edith's room, door locked, laptop open to the Grand Meridian Ballroom event program. "I need to show you something," Edith said. She explained the plan, every detail, every word they would say, every consequence they'd considered. Debbie's hands shook. "Mom will kill us." "Mom will understand. Eventually." "What if we ruin everything? What if we save everything?" Debbie looked at her twin, her mirror, her other half, the person who knew her better than anyone else in the world. "I'm scared," Debbie whispered. "Me too." "Are we really doing this?" Edith met her eyes. "I'm standing with you." And Debbie, softer, more forgiving, the twin who wanted to believe, said 5 words that changed everything. "I'm standing with you." What they were about to do would either save their family or destroy it forever. 3 days before the ceremony, Edith sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, laptop balanced on her knees, door locked. The Grand Meridian Ballroom event program glowed on her screen. She'd been studying it for 2 hours, reading every line, every segment, looking for the opening. And then she found it. Family tribute segment. Optional, informal, a space where loved ones could say a few words before the main award presentation, a loophole. "Debbie," she said, not looking up from the screen, "come here." Her twin sat down beside her. Edith turned the laptop so they could both see. "We're going to speak," Edith said simply. Debbie's hands started shaking immediately. "Mom will kill us. Mom will understand, eventually." "Edith, this is his award ceremony, in front of everyone. Investors, press, the whole industry. Exactly. Debbie stared at her sister. You want to embarrass him. I want to save him. From what? From himself. Edith's voice was calm, measured, the voice she used when she'd already made a decision and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. It was the voice that made teachers call on her in class and debate coaches recruit her, and her father recognize himself in her. He's doing it again, Edith said. Hiding, managing, controlling. But he's been good for 6 years. He has. And the second it gets uncomfortable, the second transparency threatens his image, he reverts. Pattern. Every time. Debbie wrapped her arms around herself. But what if we humiliate him and he leaves? Edith looked at her twin, really looked at her, and said the thing they'd both been too afraid to say out loud. If that's all it takes for him to leave, he was always going to. The words hung in the air between them. They weren't trying to destroy him. They were trying to save him from himself. From the part of him that still believed image mattered more than truth. From the executive who scheduled love like it was a quarterly meeting. From the man who'd learned to show up, but not how to be vulnerable. I'm scared, Debbie whispered. Me too, Edith said. That's how I know it matters. They spent the next 2 days writing the speech, not in one sitting, in fragments, between homework and dinner, and pretending everything was normal. Edith would type a sentence, delete it, rewrite it. Debbie would read it out loud, testing how the words felt in her mouth. Each word was chosen for impact, not cruelty. Should we tell him beforehand? Debbie asked on day 2. Edith shook her head. If we do, he'll stop us. Or worse, he'll give another speech about timing and strategy. What about Mom? What if Vesta gets hurt by this? Edith's fingers paused over the keyboard. She's already hurt. We're just making it visible. The morning of the ceremony, Brian stood in his study rehearsing his acceptance speech. Vesta watched from the doorway, one hand resting unconsciously on the small bump that was just beginning to show under her dress. She'd chosen something elegant but forgiving. Navy blue. Simple. The kind of dress that said she belonged at his side, but didn't need his world to define her. After tonight, we tell everyone. Together, she said. Brian looked up, smiled. I promise. He meant it. He really did. In that moment, standing in his study with the woman he loved, watching him practice a speech about legacy and leadership, Brian Rowe genuinely intended to keep that promise. But the twins were about to make sure he couldn't break it. In Edith's room, the twins got ready in silence. They'd chosen matching dresses, navy blue, like their mother's. Not identical, Edith's had long sleeves, Debbie's was sleeveless, but coordinated. Intentional. A united front. Debbie sat at the vanity, applying lipstick with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The tube slipped twice before she got it right. Her reflection stared back at her, 16 years old and about to do something that would change everything. Edith stood by the window, outwardly calm, but if you watched closely, you could see her pulse racing in her throat. Her heartbeat was a drum in her chest. Her stomach felt like it was trying to climb out of her body. But her face was granite. Last chance to back out, Debbie said, meeting her sister's eyes in the mirror. Are you backing out? Edith asked. Not if you're not. Then we're doing this. The Grand Meridian Ballroom looked like something out of a dream when they arrived. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors. Ice sculptures sweated elegantly on tables draped in white linen. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than most people's monthly rent moved through the space like they owned it. Because some of them did. This was Brian's world. Polished, powerful, perfect. Brian worked the room like the CEO he was, shaking hands, making small talk, laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny, but were told by people who controlled billions in capital. Vesta stood near the bar, elegant but isolated. She'd never fully belonged to this world, and she never would. These people knew her as Brian's, partner? Girlfriend? The mother of his children? There was no clean category for what they were, no title that fit. The twins watched from the side. Edith pulled out her phone, opened her messages, found the event coordinator's contact information she'd saved 3 days ago. "We'd like to say a few words before Dad's speech," she typed. The response came back in 30 seconds. "That's not on the program." Edith's fingers moved quickly. "It's a surprise tribute. For our father." Pause. Typing indicator. Then, "How lovely. I'll add you to the lineup. Be backstage at 7:45. Innocence weaponized. Edith showed Debbie the screen. Her twin's face went pale, then resolved. "No turning back now," Debbie whispered. "There never was." The girls were about to force the confrontation Brian had been avoiding for 16 years. But justice? That was still several painful minutes away. At 7:30, the lights began to dim. Conversations quieted. People found their seats. The energy in the room shifted from networking to anticipation. At 7:42, Edith and Debbie slipped backstage. A production assistant with a headset and a clipboard smiled at them. "You're the Rowe girls! The surprise tribute!" "Yes," Edith said. "Perfect timing. You're on in 3 minutes, right before your father accepts his award." "Perfect," Edith echoed. They stood in the wings, hidden by heavy velvet curtains. From here, they could see everything. The stage, the podium, the massive screen displaying their father's accomplishments. The audience of 1,000 people who were about to witness something none of them would forget. Debbie grabbed Edith's hand. Squeezed. Edith squeezed back. The host, a man in an expensive suit with a voice trained for public speaking, took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we present tonight's Lifetime Achievement Award, we have a special surprise. Please welcome Brian Rowe's daughters, Edith and Debbie." The audience applauded. Polite, warm, expecting something sweet. Brian, seated in the front row, looked confused. He turned to Vesta, mouthing, "Did you know about this?" She shook her head. The lights dimmed. The host took the microphone. Brian's name echoed through the ballroom like a benediction. And as Brian Rowe stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the stage to accept the award that was supposed to define his legacy, Edith and Debbie stepped out from the wings. Now here's what you need to understand. What happened next wasn't a scandal. It was an intervention. The stage lights were blinding. Hotter than Edith had expected. She could feel sweat forming at the base of her neck, but her hands were steady on the microphone. "Before our father accepts this award," she said, and her voice, thank God, her voice, didn't shake. From where she stood, Edith could see her father's face change. Confusion first. The slight tilt of his head. The way his hand froze halfway to adjusting his tie. Then recognition. Then panic, pure, visceral panic that made his eyes go wide and his breath catch. Brian's internal monologue was screaming, "What are they doing here? Why are they on stage? This wasn't planned. This isn't..." And then fear, not of the cameras, not of the 1,000 witnesses. Fear of the truth he'd been managing for 2 weeks, finally breaking free. In the audience, Vesta's hand went to her stomach the moment she saw her daughters. Instinctive, protective. And in that gesture, she understood everything. They're doing this for the baby. "Dad," Debbie said, and her voice trembled but held. "We wanted to give you a real award tonight." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Polite, uncertain. Edith stepped forward. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her skull, but her face was steel. "You've always said leadership means responsibility," she said, eyes locked on her father's. "And a legacy means telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." The laughter died. "And the truth is that our family is about to grow." Debbie swallowed, looked at her father, said the words that would change everything. "You're going to have another child." Silence crashed over the ballroom like a wave. Then the cameras started. Flash, 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 like lightning strikes, rapid-fire clicks that sounded like 1,000 tiny explosions. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers, multiplied by the marble floors. Gasps rippled through the rows, sharp intakes of breath that moved through the crowd like dominoes falling. An investor in the third row leaned forward, face a mix of shock and calculation, already running the PR math, figuring out what this meant for stock prices. A journalist near the press section was typing furiously on her phone, fingers flying. The host stood frozen offstage, clipboard dangling from his hand, mouth slightly open. Clayton, Brian's COO, his right hand, his damage control specialist, stood abruptly, phone already out, typing what was probably the beginning of a crisis management plan. But then something unexpected happened. A woman in the back started clapping, not celebratory, not enthusiastic, slow, deliberate, supportive. Then another woman joined her. Then scattered applause began to build, not for the announcement, but for something else, for transparency, for courage, for two teenage girls forcing accountability in a room full of people who'd built empires on managing narratives. It felt more like solidarity than celebration. Brian stood there, frozen in the spotlight, and felt every possible response war inside him. He could deny it, laugh it off as a misunderstanding. He could deflect, turn it into a joke. He could control the narrative the way he'd controlled everything else. But instead, Brian Rowe lifted one hand and said two words that changed his life. "Let them speak." The ballroom went completely silent. "This award was supposed to honor my leadership," Brian said, his voice rough, unpolished, nothing like the practiced speeches he'd given 1,000 times before. He looked at his daughters, really looked at them. "But tonight, they reminded me that leadership starts at home." He turned toward Vesta, standing near the back with one hand still on the child she was carrying. "And I failed you once." The confession tasted like liberation and loss all at once. "I won't do that again." Not performed, not calculated, raw. This moment would be replayed 4.7 million times in the next 48 hours. Security moved fast, professional, efficient. The twins were ushered off stage before the crowd could fully process what had happened, guided through backstage corridors by men in dark suits with earpieces. They found themselves in a side corridor, concrete walls, exposed pipes, the unglamorous skeleton of the glamorous ballroom. Edith was breathing hard. Debbie's hands were shaking so violently she had to press them against her sides. "Did we just—" Debbie started. "Yeah," Edith said. "We did." Footsteps. Fast. Familiar. Vesta rounded the corner. The twins braced themselves, for anger, for disappointment, for the consequences of what they'd just done. Instead, Vesta pulled them both into a hug. Tight. Fierce. The kind of hug that says, "I've got you and I'm terrified and I love you all at once." "You shouldn't have done that," Vesta said, her voice muffled against Debbie's hair. "We know," Edith said, "but thank you." Debbie started crying. Full body sobs. Adrenaline crash. The weight of what they'd just done hitting all at once. More footsteps. Heavier. Male. Brian appeared at the end of the corridor, walking through the backstage chaos like it didn't exist. Clayton was behind him, frantic. "Brian, we need to do damage control. The board is already calling. We need a statement. We need—" "Later," Brian said, not even looking back. He stopped a few feet away from his daughters and Vesta. The four of them in a concrete corridor, while 1,000 people in the ballroom whispered and photographed and formed opinions. Long silence. Then Brian did something no one expected. He knelt, physically lowering himself. CEO to supplicant. Father to children he'd finally learned to see. "You were braver than I was," he said. "We shouldn't have had to be," Edith replied, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "I know. I was going to tell everyone," Brian said, "after tonight." "That's the problem, Dad," Edith said, and her voice cracked on the word problem. "It was always after the deal, after the ceremony, after it's convenient." "We didn't do this to hurt you," Debbie added, gesturing toward Vesta's stomach. "We did it to protect them." And in that moment, kneeling on a concrete floor in a backstage corridor, while his empire trembled and his reputation hung in the balance, Brian Rowe finally understood. This wasn't punishment. This was love. You know what nobody tells you about being brave? It doesn't feel like courage in the moment. It feels like your heart might explode. It feels like you might throw up. It feels like you're ruining everything. But sometimes, the only way to save something is to break it open first. And if that's hitting different right now, you're not alone. That's the power of truth told at the right time, even when the right time feels like the worst time. By morning, Brian Rowe's name was trending worldwide. The think pieces wrote themselves: Billionaire CEO exposed by daughters versus A Family's Brave, stand for transparency. Tech blogs, business journals, lifestyle magazines. Everyone had an opinion about what those 16-year-old girls had done on that stage. But the real story? That was happening far from the headlines. 48 hours after the Grand Meridian Ballroom, Brian Rowe's face was everywhere. Not the way he'd planned. Not the visionary CEO accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award. The other version, the exposed one, the human one. Billionaire's secret pregnancy revealed by teen daughters. Modern family drama or PR disaster? When your children become your accountability partners? The headlines scrolled endlessly. Business journals, lifestyle blogs, tech sites. Everyone had an angle. Think pieces on fatherhood, on accountability, on privilege, on what happens when the carefully constructed image of a billionaire CEO cracks wide open and the mess underneath spills out for everyone to see. Brian's company stock had dipped 70% in 2 days. 7%. Millions of dollars in market value evaporated because two 16-year-old girls told the truth on a stage. Board members were calling emergency meetings. And Brian knew exactly what was coming. The conference room on the 42nd floor was cold, expensive, hostile. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A table that cost more than most people's cars. 12 board members in suits that whispered wealth and power. Marcus Chen, longtime investor, early believer, the man who'd written the first major check when Brian was nobody, sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed. "This is an optics nightmare," Marcus said without preamble. Another board member, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper words, leaned forward. "Your personal life is affecting shareholder value." Clayton, Brian's COO, jumped in. Damage control mode, the role he'd perfected over a decade. "We can spin this. Redemption arc. Family man narrative. The CEO who chooses transparency." "I don't want to spin anything," Brian said. The room went quiet. Marcus stared at him. "Then you're not thinking like a CEO." Brian met his gaze. Held it. "Maybe I've been thinking like a CEO for too long." You could hear the collective intake of breath, the shift in the room. This wasn't the Brian Rowe they knew. The one who managed crises, who controlled narratives, who always put the company first. Brian stood. The chair scraped against the marble floor. "I'm taking paternity leave." The room erupted. You can't just, the company needs. Think about the investors. I'm thinking about my children, all three of them, Brian said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus stood too, face red, jaw tight. If you do this, we'll call for a vote of no confidence. Brian looked at him, at the man who'd believed in him when he was 28, with nothing but a pitch deck and ambition, at the man who'd made him rich, who'd helped build this empire. Then vote, Brian said, and he walked out. That night, Brian showed up at Vesta's apartment with Thai takeout instead of flowers. Still in his suit, tie loosened, top button undone. He looked exhausted, human, more real than he'd looked in years. He sat on her couch, the same couch where they'd had 1,000 conversations over 6 years, and put his head in his hands. I might lose the company, he said. Vesta sat beside him, close but not touching, giving him space to feel whatever he needed to feel. Do you care? She asked. Long pause. So long Vesta thought he might not answer. Less than I thought I would, Brian finally said. Vesta smiled, small, sad, proud. That's growth. In Edith's room, the twins sat on her bed, laptop open between them, scrolling through headlines and social media posts about their father. We destroyed his career, Edith said, her voice hollow. Guilt spiraling the way she did when she couldn't fix something. We freed him, Debbie countered. What if he resents us? Debbie didn't answer, just pointed toward the doorway. Through it, they could see their father in the living room, sitting on the couch next to their mother. He was laughing at something Vesta said, not the polished laugh he used in boardrooms. Real laughter, the kind that shakes your shoulders and makes your eyes crinkle. They hadn't seen him laugh like that in years, maybe ever. On day 3, something unexpected happened. A video went viral. A female board member from a different tech company, someone with no connection to Brian, no stake in his success or failure, posted a video that started with 5 words. I need to say something. She spoke directly to the camera. No script, no PR team. Just a woman who'd spent 30 years in boardrooms watching men prioritize image over integrity. For once, a CEO is choosing accountability over image, and we're punishing him for it? She talked about the double standards, about how female executives were expected to balance family and work flawlessly, while male executives were praised just for showing up to their kids' events. About how transparency was only valued when it was convenient. Brian Rowe's daughters did something brave, and instead of celebrating that his children feel safe enough to hold him accountable, we're treating it like a scandal. The video hit 2 million views in 6 hours. Stand with Brian started trending. Mothers shared stories of absent fathers who never showed up. Daughters wrote about the fathers who chose careers over custody. Families posted about the messy, complicated work of rebuilding trust after it's been broken. The narrative shifted, not immediately, not completely, but enough. Investors started backing down, not because they believed in family values, but because they believed in market sentiment. And the market was saying, maybe authenticity matters more than perfection. That board meeting, it would become a Harvard Business School case study on leadership versus legacy. 3 weeks later, the board voted, not to remove Brian, not to force him out or demand his resignation or install Clayton as interim CEO. They voted to approve his paternity leave. First time in company history. When Brian heard the news, he was in Vesta's kitchen, helping her assemble a crib they'd ordered online. Debbie was reading instructions out loud. Edith was organizing screws by size because that's how her brain worked. Normal, domestic, real. His phone rang. Clayton. The vote just finished, Clayton said. Brian braced himself. They approved it. 3 months paid paternity leave, full benefits, The board issued a statement supporting your decision. Brian sat down hard on the floor, surrounded by crib parts and instruction manuals, and the three people who'd forced him to choose differently. And for the first time in his adult life, Brian Rowe cried in public. Not hidden in a bathroom, or a car, or a hotel room, far from anyone who knew him. Right there on Vesta's kitchen floor, with his daughters watching and Vesta's hand on his shoulder, and a half-assembled crib as witness. He cried because he'd almost lost everything. And he cried because he'd almost lost the only things that mattered. 5 months later, Brian Rowe stood in what would become his son's nursery, holding an Allen wrench and squinting at crib assembly instructions written in 3 languages, none of which seemed to be actual English. "No, the long bolt goes through the side panel first," Vesta said from the rocking chair, one hand resting on her now prominent belly. Brian looked up, confused. "The diagram shows. The diagram is wrong, trust me. 3rd crib I've assembled." Role reversal. The CEO taking direction from the woman who'd always been his equal, but whom he'd never let lead. In the doorway, the twins were arguing. "Sage green is calming," Edith said, holding up a paint swatch. "Babies don't care about color psychology," Debbie countered. Studies also show babies can't even see color properly for the first few months. Normal. Beautifully, boringly normal. This was what transformation looked like. Not grand gestures or press conferences or redemption arcs manufactured by PR teams. Just a man with an Allen wrench, getting it wrong, being corrected, trying again. The change had been gradual. Small acts compounding into something that looked like consistent presence. Parenting books appeared on Brian's nightstand. What to expect when you're expecting. The Expectant Father. How to talk so kids will listen. Titles. He would have been embarrassed to be seen reading 6 months ago. He attended Lamaze classes without complaint. Sat on the floor with a dozen other couples, practicing breathing techniques, listening to a nurse explain contractions and dilation with the same focus he used to reserve for quarterly earnings reports. Debbie had filmed him learning to change diapers on a practice doll, both of them laughing until they couldn't breathe when he put the diaper on backwards twice. He showed up to Edith's college interviews, drove her to campuses, waited in coffee shops while she toured, asked thoughtful questions about her impressions afterward. He made Vesta breakfast, not ordered it, not paid someone else to make it. Actually stood in the kitchen with eggs and a spatula, learning through trial and error. Small acts, repeated, consistent, present. The family therapy session had been Brian's idea. That alone was growth. They sat in a comfortable office with soft lighting and a therapist named Dr. Okafor, who had kind eyes and a direct way of asking questions that made avoidance impossible. "What changed?" she asked. Edith spoke first. "He stopped managing us and started seeing us." Debbie nodded. "He stopped scheduling love and started living it." Vesta smiled softly. "He stopped running." Brian looked at his family. "They stopped letting me." "And how does that feel?" Dr. Okafor asked. Brian was quiet for a long moment, then terrifying and right. After therapy, in the car ride home, Edith finally said what she'd been holding for months. Traffic was light. Rain tapped against the windshield. Just the two of them, Vesta and Debbie, had taken a separate car to run errands. "I need to know you won't leave when it gets hard," Edith said, her voice small in a way it rarely was. Brian kept his eyes on the road. "It's already hard. I'm still here. When the baby cries all night, still here. When mom is exhausted and not nice about it, still here. When your board calls you weak, still here." And then Edith, analytical, controlled, the twin who kept score, and built walls and protected herself by never expecting too much. Edith broke. She sobbed. Full body, shoulder-shaking sobs. I just don't want them to feel like we did. Brian pulled over, right there on the side of the highway, hazard lights blinking. He reached across the console and held his daughter. They won't, I promise. How do I believe you? She asked through tears. Watch me. 2 weeks later, at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, Vesta's water broke. Brian didn't panic, didn't fumble, didn't turn into the chaotic, anxious version of himself he'd been 16 years ago. He drove steadily, hand in hers, while the twins sat in the back seat, radiating nervous excitement. The hospital room became their world for the next 14 hours. Brian never left Vesta's side. Through every contraction, and there were dozens, each one harder than the last, he held her hand, whispered encouragement, became the steady presence she'd needed 16 years ago, and was finally receiving now. You're the strongest person I know, he whispered during hour 12, when exhaustion had turned Vesta's face pale and made her hands shake. You've always been. The twins took turns sitting with them, bringing ice chips, telling terrible jokes to distract from the pain, being the kind of support system that only exists when family chooses to show up. At 4:47 p.m., a cry filled the room. Small, indignant, perfect. A baby boy. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Vesta collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted, glowing, more beautiful than Brian had ever seen her. The doctor placed the baby on Vesta's chest. Would you like to cut the cord? Brian's hands shook as he took the surgical scissors. This small act, one he'd missed twice before, felt monumental. Edith and Debbie crowded close to meet their brother. Debbie started crying immediately, the way she always did when emotions overwhelmed her. Edith tried not to cry, failed completely, tears streaming down her face as she touched the baby's impossibly tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around Brian's finger, instinctive, trusting. This is the moment worth waiting for. Not the drama, not the scandal. This, the quiet, sacred ordinary of a family choosing each other. And if you've stayed with this story all the way here, you understand something important. Real transformation doesn't happen on stages. It happens in nurseries at 4:47 p.m., when a man finally shows up for the life he almost missed. This is what legacy really looks like. They named him James Roe Kim, both last names, no hierarchy. And when Brian held him in that hospital room, surrounded by Vesta and his daughters, watching this tiny human who would grow up knowing his father from day one, who would never have to wonder if he was wanted, never have to keep score, never have to force accountability, because it would be given freely. Brian finally understood what the twins had done that night at the Grand Meridian Ballroom. They hadn't exposed him. They'd freed him. 1 year later, James Roe Kim celebrated his first birthday in the backyard of the home his father had moved into. Not a penthouse with a view of the city skyline, but Vesta's house with the slightly overgrown garden and the porch that creaked. It was a small gathering, not a PR event, no photographers, no carefully curated guest list designed to impress investors, just family, just the people who mattered. Edith was home from college for the weekend, her first semester of business ethics courses, making her even more formidable than before. She sat on the porch steps, watching her baby brother demolish a cupcake with the focused intensity of someone conducting a scientific experiment. Debbie held James on her hip, making exaggerated faces that sent him into fits of giggles. She was studying child psychology now, determined to help families learn to communicate before the damage became permanent. Clayton showed up with a gift, a wooden rocking horse he'd built himself, which surprised everyone, including Clayton. I took a woodworking class, he explained, embarrassed. Needed a hobby that wasn't crisis management. Even Marcus, the board member who'd threatened a vote of no confidence, sent a card. It arrived that morning. Simple, handwritten. Congratulations on what matters most. Brian's new normal looked nothing like his old one. He was still CEO. The company hadn't collapsed without his round-the-clock attention. In fact, it had thrived. Stock prices were up 12%. Turns out ethical leadership actually increased investor confidence. But now, Brian left the office at 5 p.m., missed galas when they conflicted with bedtime stories, said no to opportunities that required him to be anything other than present. Industry publications wrote articles, "The CEO who chose family and won." But the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the ordinary moments. James's first word, his first steps. The way he reached for Brian when he walked through the door. The trust that doesn't require explanation because it's been there from the beginning. The twins had grown in ways that made Vesta's heart ache with pride. Edith had declared business ethics as her major, full circle from the girl who'd watched her father compartmentalize morality for profit. She told a classmate during orientation, "My dad didn't become a good father because he wanted to. He became one because we demanded it." Debbie had written an essay for a teen magazine titled "How I Saved My Father by Embarrassing Him." It went viral. Teenagers shared it. Parents sent it to their partners. Therapists printed it for clients. Both girls credited that night at the Grand Meridian Ballroom as their defining moment. Not the scandal, the courage. Vesta and Brian never got married. It was a choice, not an oversight. They didn't need a ceremony to prove commitment. What they had was deeper than paperwork. It was the daily choosing, the showing up, the work of building something together after it had been broken. Vesta still called him out when he slipped into CEO mode, when his voice took on that boardroom authority, or when he tried to manage family decisions instead of participating in them. Brian cooked breakfast every Sunday, learned to make pancakes the way James liked them, scrambled eggs the way Vesta preferred them. Simple acts that said, "I'm here. I choose this. I choose you." When James took his first steps at 11 months, both parents were there to see it. Not one parent texting the other about what they'd missed. Both of them, sitting on the living room floor, arms outstretched, catching him when his tiny legs wobbled. 6 months after James's birthday, Brian received another industry award. Different venue, different honor. But this time, everything was different. His family sat in the front row, not hidden in the back, not absent, front and center. When Brian took the stage, he didn't start with business metrics or market disruption or visionary leadership. He started with them. "A year ago, my daughters interrupted an award ceremony. Best thing that ever happened to me." The audience, some of whom had been in that other ballroom, who'd witnessed the scandal firsthand, sat forward. They reminded me that real leadership starts at home, that transparency isn't weakness, that love isn't something you schedule. Standing ovation. The camera cut to Vesta holding James, tears streaming down her face. To Edith and Debbie holding hands, proud and tearful, and exactly where they belonged. In Brian's office, there's a new photo on his desk. Not hidden in a drawer like the old ones. Not tucked away like secrets or shame. Center stage. Impossible to miss. All 5 of them. Vesta, Brian, Edith, Debbie, James. Messy, candid, real. James is mid-laugh, his tiny hand reaching toward the camera. Debbie is making the face that caused the laugh. Edith is smiling. Actually smiling, in a way she rarely did before. Vesta leans into Brian, comfortable, trusting. And Brian looks like a man who's finally home. Underneath the photo, in a small brass frame, is a quote. "We don't want our sibling growing up as a secret." Brian touches that frame every morning. Before emails, before meetings, before the world makes demands. A reminder, this is what matters. Brian Rowe didn't lose his legacy that night at the Grand Meridian Ballroom. He found it. Because legacy isn't applause. It's not power. It's the courage to let your children rewrite the ending. And sometimes, the bravest thing a parent can do is let themselves be saved. Stories like this don't go viral because they're scandalous. They go viral because they're true. Because somewhere, in Brian's failure and redemption, Investa's quiet strength, in those twins' impossible courage, you see yourself. You see your family. You see the patterns you're trying to break, or the love you're trying to build. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think about your own family, your own choices, your own second chances, then it deserves to find someone else who needs it. Someone scrolling at 11 p.m., wondering if change is possible. Someone who needs to see that it's never too late to choose differently. That's what stories are for. Not just to entertain, but to remind us we're not alone in the mess and the magic of being human. So share it. Talk about it. Let it ripple. Because the next person who hears this might be the one brave enough to take the microphone.